Hi, this is Mr. Cordes, and this, ladies and gentlemen, is the week 1 lecture video for English 353 children's literature. I start us off here on a Wikipedia page for The Princess and Curdie simply because it's the best place to find a good synopsis and a good kind of preview to the story. Not a lot of people are familiar with George MacDonald as a fairy tale writer or as a children's lit writer. However, his fantasy works do kind of classify and go into this children's literature realm simply because of the tone, simply because of the themes, the ideas of readership. The different literary components that you've read through with Reynolds, our primary text for this class, do thread through a lot of George MacDonald's work. So we are able to kind of classify and move him over. But I wanted to offer this page to you. You can do a little Google search and find it for yourself. It's a great way to kind of get a heads up as far as what you are about to read. One of the biggest things to note is that it is a follow-up to The Princess and the Goblin. So if you need to go and read through The Princess and the Goblin or get a synopsis, you can. Doing a preview, I think, with literature is always beneficial. Just like you would see a movie trailer before going to see a movie, you get a general idea of what that story is about, what to expect, kind of the feeling of it. And so by doing that with literature, it actually helps kind of guide you in, offers a roadmap, if you will, to what to expect. But for this, I kind of need to back up for a moment. When we look at fairy tales, and you have got a lot of different fairy tales for this week, we have to understand the history. Now, to embody the history of children's literature in a quick little lecture video is not going to do justice. I, for myself, always understood that children's literature happens once there was an author who said, I'm going to write this story for a child. Okay. There's two components, the story itself and then the child. So like I previously mentioned, the child brings a certain aspect to the readership because it helps shape the content of what's being presented. So there's lots of things in there. And we as adults can definitely identify the difference between this is an adult piece of fiction versus this is for a child, and the variations that go along with it. But I believe that children's literature did not start until there was a child and an author who said, I'm going to write you a story. If you even go back to Greco-Roman myths, where you are learning about the gods and goddesses, there are lessons to be learned for how to behave and act. And part of children's literature is the moral or lesson that's being learned. What do our characters learn, and how does that transition into the child reader? Okay. As you go through all of these different readings, you're going to kind of begin to see very foundational lessons, foundational elements that you are familiar with. You and I'm going to click on over here. You and I are very familiar with Disney, and Disney has taken fairy tales and twisted and turned them into something completely different than what they originally were. So even though while we have to recognize Disney and the Disney fairy tales, they are essentially an evolved mythology, an evolved storyline, an evolved and different idea of what the story originated as. So there's great things on the internet and YouTube as far as comparing and contrasting Disney versus Grimm. You can see it right here. But there's a very innocent, childlike component to Disney, the happy ending, right? The fairy tale happy ending, finding the prince or the princess and overcoming evil. All of those components, and there's small pieces to the original. So when we're going through our stories, you're reading with a much different capacity because these are much darker. They are purposefully written to teach people a lesson. When you go through here, like The Lion and the Mouse, The Dog and His Reflection, you are picking up on a very straightforward message, moral lesson to be learned, versus the Disney, oh, everyone is happy and my dreams came true, right? Which is great and fine. I always really enjoyed watching a Disney film and then actually like reading the original version. It's always fun to tell, well, it's not fun to tell kids that Cinderella's sisters cut their toes off in order to fit the shoe into the slipper, but it makes them kind of go like, that's not Disney at all. I remember reading The Hunchback of Notre Dame when Disney released it, because it was an assignment in high school for me. And I remember it was just so dark and different than what Disney had presented. And I actually fell in love more with Victor Hugo's work than I did with the animated version. So understand that those are the components. Looking at children's literature, if you break it down, the history comes with the idea of what are we telling children? What is the lesson that needs to be learned? So even when you read through Princess and Curdie or Princess and the Goblin by MacDonald, you are understanding that there's a lesson, that there's a moral to that story. And what is it that we are picking up on? So it's almost the idea of entertaining as well as educating. Those are the components of children's literature. And when we look at a piece of children's literature, what is it? How is it grasping my attention? And then how is it teaching me a lesson? So currently right now I'm reading through the Percy Jackson books, the Heroes of Olympus. It's that second series. Because my son has read through them like wildfire. He goes through them, a couple books every day, or every couple days. And so for him, he's devouring these things and I need to catch up and read along with him. He then begins to understand what is he learning, right? He tells me and talks to me about these characters who are learning lessons and doing things. It's entertaining because it deals with this whimsical fantasy of Greek and Roman gods, but it's also dealing with what is he learning about how to behave, how to interact with others. A lot of times, and it's not done purposefully, but there is a small underlining current theme of what is the child going to learn from this story, from this fable, from this folktale. As you see through here, there's lots of different things. You may step back from Hansel and Gretel and be like, that is not the fairy tale that I'm familiar with. That is much different. And the part where I talked, I think I mentioned this in a previous video, the idea that children's literature is very fresh. And I say the word fresh simply because new things can come in, but also there's this realm where things can be added to, changed, or modified. So if you look at this, let's look at the story of Cinderella, which we will do in some upcoming weeks. If we look at Cinderella, that story has changed multiple times because of cultural influence, because of relevance in time for audience members. What is it that we're learning? There's so many different capacities that children's literature is very fresh and very tangible in the way that we're able to manipulate it for our own needs. So doing a cultural study could be a component of children's literature because each piece of children's literature from around the world is going to gear towards what is happening in that particular culture and time, and reference to the historical components of the world and life, right? So as you go through this, and as you go through Reynolds' introduction, you'll kind of pick up on how things have evolved. You'll pick up on the foundational components of children's literature, but then you as the scholar can be able to identify, wow, that has changed within the last 20 years. That has changed within the last, century. Wow, that story is really prevalent to Europe and during, this time frame and what was happening then. One of the things that my son loves besides reading is his history. He loves historical wars. He's into like warplanes. He's actually into these books right now called Soldier Dogs, where there's a dog almost kind of like Call of the Wild, where the dog is in a World War II or a Vietnam War, like they're in a war setting. So he picks up on the historical side, but he also picks up on the right versus wrong. He picks up on the lesson that's being learned. So when he is going through these stories, just like if he was to read some of these, he'd be able to pick up on that. And that's part of children's literature as a whole. What is the message that's being conveyed? What is the child reader picking up on? Because you and I as adults, we're picking up on a different message than what the child is picking on. So we have to get into the mindset of what is the child really going through. When the child reads Princess and Curdie, they're going to get a different takeaway from this than you and I will. So understanding those components, looking at that as far as how is that different, unique for the story that's being told. Okay. So read through the text. That's going to be your primary goal of understanding those underlining things. That will help you when it comes time to your response papers and your reflections. The response paper, you're picking up on a component. Maybe it's the historical context of where Princess and Curdie is coming from versus Aesop's fables. Looking at the Cinderella and the Glass Slipper adaptation versus, where is that in the world versus where Princess and the Curdie is in the world. And when I say in the world, what is the world region in which that is derived from? What was going on? If it comes from Europe, what was going on for Europe during the time it was written, right? What are those influences, right? If you look at, let's say, the Chronicles of Narnia, which we will do in later weeks, the Chronicles of Narnia is very influenced by Christian themes. However, you have to take into consideration where it was written, what was going on in that world, and what was going on in that time. So children's authors kind of implement that into their writing. Roald Dahl wrote 2 Charlie and the Chocolate Factory books. He wrote the first one, and then years later, he wrote Charlie and the Great Glass Elevator. If you read The Great Glass Elevator, it's actually very heavily influenced by the space exploration in the mid-1900s in the US. There was the race for space, like that whole idea. And so that's actually very prevalent because as soon as the story takes over, it's a completely different story because it's heavily influenced by the technology and the new world versus the first book, Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, where you are dealing with this idea of struggle coming out of the Great Depression, establishing yourselves, trying to find what works and what doesn't, and kind of the behaviors of children that manifest from that. So when you analyze literature, you have to take in all of those components. And for children's literature, it's also prevalent because what is then the story that's being told? What is the message that is being conveyed? So I can sit here and I can look at Disney films and look at Snow White from the 1930-ish, 1939, whenever it was released in the 30s. But if I look back at the other stories of Snow White, what's going on there? How is that? So a lot of us look to the future. Like there's been movie adaptations of Snow White. There's stories that branch off. Oh gosh, I'm drawing a blank. The guy who wrote Wicked, McGower, I think is his name. I think I'm getting his name wrong. He did an evolution of like the Wicked Witch from The Wizard of Oz. He's done one for Snow White. There's so many things that evolve, and that kind of pushes us forward. Yet if we turn and look back, we've got to see where we're coming from. Where does this story generate? Where does this story actually take us in time? Okay, which is really prevalent because that helps us to identify where we're going in the future, especially with the idea of what's the message that's being conveyed. Okay, so take some time this week to go through and read these different components. If there's a story or item that's confusing to you, take some time to get a preview. Wikipedia is a relatively good resource just to get a general idea of what to expect. But then you also have other components. I have a feeling you would be able to find all of these items in an audio form if listening is better for you. That always kind of helps my brain relax sometimes if I just listen to a short story versus sitting and analyzing. All entirely up to you. But again, looking at children's literature, we have to know what goes on into the past. So when you are reading, take those things into consideration, because all of those things push towards the child. When was this written? Where was it written? Why was it written? Right? And how does that impact the child? Okay. Hope you guys enjoy this. There's some other videos here for you as well. I'll find, perhaps if I can find some ancillary things about children's literature, I'll put those up as well. But yeah, message me if you have any questions or concerns. I'll talk to you guys later.